Hello everyone and welcome to another video with me, 320 Sim Pilot, and today we're going to be looking at landing the A320 NEO in Microsoft Flight Simulator. As I always say at the start of these videos, I am a real-world Airbus pilot, but none of this is for any real-world use. It's just to give you some extra context in your home flight simulation, and hopefully it can help you out with those landings in the A320. Now, of course, there are some glitches we know about, which I'll talk about as we go, and we may even encounter whilst we make this video, but hopefully this can give you a technique that will last you through your use of Flight Simulator, and fingers crossed, these glitches get updated and they no longer become such an issue. We're going to be doing this in Venice today, as you can see, a lovely day here in Venice, and we're going to be landing on the runway 04 right. For the first approach, I'm going to do an ILS approach, and then we'll have a go at some landings using just visual guidance. So let's get started. To start off with, I'm just going to show you the setup I have in the flight deck at the moment. If you need help with any of this, I do have a video on flying an ILS approach, which is how we're going to begin, so I highly recommend you watch that first. As you can see here, if you've seen that video, this will probably make sense to you. We're going to be 3,000 feet as we fly around these waypoints, and then we're going to intercept the ILS over here at FI 04 right at 3,000 feet. The ILS is tuned. It says ILS 04 right, Victor Tango Sierra there, and we have a distance to the runway 12.1 nautical miles. I've selected the LS button up here, which allows me to see the localizer and the glide slope on the PFD. Autopilot 1 is in use. We're currently using speed mode on the auto thrust, which is correct, which is good. This seems to have changed, or it seems to be working more like I would expect it to these days. In terms of speed, we currently have the approach phase already activated. It did that automatically, which is why it's currently flying at this speed. I'm in managed speed, so as I put the flaps out, that will reduce. I've said before, this should fly at green dot speed. I don't know why it doesn't, so it's actually a little bit slower than I would expect. Having said that, I would probably say green dot looks higher than I would expect. At this weight, at 60 tons, yeah, it normally is a bit closer to this VLS here. So I think it's perfectly safe for what we're doing. It's just, yeah, it's slightly unusual. I've got medium auto brake selected, and we're going to go and have a look at flying round this ILS. So I'll see you again on final approach when we're fully configured and ready for landing. Okay, so now we are turning onto final approach. We're pointing in towards the airport, and I'm going to arm the approach button. It's gone onto localizer mode, glide slope is armed, and soon we'll be pointing, hopefully, down the center line towards the runway. Again, if you need help with understanding how I'm doing this and what modes we're looking at up here, then please do watch my ILS tutorial video, which will cover some of that, and I have a follow-up video to answer some more questions. Okay, we have a bit of a tailwind on the approach, which we can see here. We're heading 040, which is the way we're going to land, and there's 4 knots tailwind. So if that happens to you, you just need to make sure you slow down a little bit earlier. So in this case, I'm going to put out flaps 2 before I'm on the glide slope to make sure I have room to slow down, and then I'll put the gear down. I would normally say by 5 miles. This is not a rule, it's just an idea, but I'm going to do it slightly earlier. I'm going to do it at 6 miles today as a latest. We can see we're 11 miles at the moment from the runway down here. So here comes the glide slope. Flaps go to 2, as I said, and that way the engines will reduce, the speed will reduce, and we'll intercept the glide slope. It's not too strong of a tailwind either. So some things we want to discuss before we get into the landing. Well, essentially, a good tip in Flight Simulator is to press the space bar by default, which gives you into the landing view, and then you can see outside better, and that's more representative of where we would end up sitting in the real aircraft. You get this sort of view out the window, which is actually really good. The Airbus has a very good view forwards and down as well. When we are on final approach, I'm expecting the thrust levers to stay in the climb gate. That's what this is called, where it says CL for climb. This limits the auto thrust to climb thrust, but as you can see here, it says A/THR, A/THR. This is telling me that this area is where the auto thrust is active. And I can see that I'm in speed mode, which confirms that the auto thrust is targeting the speed on the speed tape. So this is where you want to be on final approach. Even if you're not doing an ILS, you want to have auto thrust in speed mode and those thrust levers in the climb gate. What I'm going to do from here is continue flying. As we get lower, I'm going to start looking out more to get an idea of where the runway is. If it's a good day and you've got a nice clear visual picture out the window like we do today, then around 500 feet onwards, so after 500 feet in the descent and onwards, time to put the gear down. So gear comes down. We're going to arm those speed brakes so that when we touch down, they're going to come up. So make sure you lift that up to arm them. Then we're going to put up the rest of the flap. So check that speed. So we're below those amber eyebrows. Flaps go to 3. Oh, there we go. Now the speed reduces. And we're below the next amber eyebrows, they're called, or equal signs, which tells me I'm below the speed, so I can put the next stage of flap out. So now we're fully configured and on final approach, we have medium auto brake selected up here. So what we're going to do is, from about 500 feet onwards, start looking out and using the visual picture of runway 04 right, which is up here. We're going to use those visual cues and keep our rate of descent steady. So our current rate of descent is currently 900 to 800 feet per minute. So what you want to do is keep that rate of descent, because that's following the 3-degree approach. So when we disconnect the autopilot, we're going to keep that. You could disconnect now and follow the flight directives, or you can disconnect a bit later on. We are stable at 1,000 feet and ready for our landing. Stable means we are fully configured, we're on all the right profile. Different airlines have different requirements of what stable is and when it needs to be, but there we go, this is a sensible approach so far. So we're going to take out the autopilot, just looking out, primarily looking in just to get an idea of the rate of descent and check the speed is okay. Then we're going to aim for the middle of the touchdown zone, so that's somewhere just past these big markers here. I'm just going to keep aiming there. You can see we have 2 whites, 2 reds on the pappies. If it was 3 reds, we're a bit low. If it was 3 whites, we're a bit high. If it's 4 whites, we're really high. If it's 4 reds, we're really low. Here's 500 feet, so let's take out the autopilot. What I'm doing now is aiming the aircraft towards the middle of that, just looking in occasionally to check that my rate of descent is sitting at around 800 feet per minute. Those pappies are useful, but they become very sensitive close in, so you just end up looking into that touchdown zone to try and aim for the right area. So 1,000 feet per minute, I can see my rate of descent is a little bit high, so let's correct that back to 900. Aiming for the middle of that touchdown zone. As we pass through 50 feet, I'm going to start thinking about flaring. 30, I need to pull back on the side stick. By touchdown, I must idle the thrust levers, so they are now at idle. Hold the nose, hold that pitch, and then let it settle on the runway. Once the main gear is down, we can select reverse, so I get reverse green. Let that nose wheel settle onto the runway, and you should see a down arrow here. So now I have reverse as idle reverse, and we have decel. It lights up here, but primarily we're looking for deceleration here on the speed tape of the PFT. On the real aircraft, we also look for ground spoilers, but they don't show up on this model just yet. And there we go. That is us down on the runway in Venice. So let's go through that again and talk about some of the other features. So we are now flying downwind to go and have another go at that landing. So what are the important parts to take away from it? Well, you have to have the setup right, so you need to be on a stable approach. So as you saw, at 1,000 feet above the runway, we had the correct configuration, we were at the correct approach speed, and we were on the correct center line, so we were lined up with the runway, and we were on the correct profile vertically, so we were on the glide slope, which was 3 degrees today. As we get lower, start to look out more. So through 500 feet from the runway, if you can, being able to look out will really help you. So you're looking out more and more until we get down to the last few hundred feet, and then you are primarily looking out. From that point on, you're aiming in towards the touchdown zone, so into the middle, looking for those markers, and that's where you're aiming. The pappies are useful, but as you get lower, they will become too sensitive. But they are useful at first to tell you if you're low or high. Maintain that rate of descent from the ILS, so if you know the autopilot was doing 800 feet per minute, then you know that should be good for your approach. If you need to correct a little bit, that's fine, but always return to that original rate of descent once you are back on the vertical profile you want to be on. At 50 feet, you're getting ready to flare. The Airbus will then say 40 feet, and at 30 feet, you want to flare. Now you can adjust that slightly. If you feel like you're sinking too fast, you may need to flare slightly earlier than 30 feet. If you feel like you are a little bit shallow, coming in a little bit low, then you may want to flare a little bit later. It depends. but around 30 feet you want to think about flaring. Flaring is just a small pitch up of the nose and then letting it reduce that rate of descent. So you just need to pitch up a few degrees. Don't look inside for that, just look out to the end of the runway and just raise that nose a little bit, just enough so that you're not going back up again, just to reduce that rate of descent for the touchdown. Hold that back pressure when you enter the flare. You'll need to just keep it slightly with a bit of back pressure. If you find that you're going up again or you are floating for too long, you may need to go around, which we'll cover in another video. But it could also be that if you're just a little bit not settling down on the runway, you're just floating along a little bit, you can release a bit of that back pressure, but don't ever put the nose down. Don't put any forward pressure onto the joystick. Just maybe release a little bit of the back pressure. There's a pitch limit of 10 degrees. You don't want to go with the nose higher than 10 degrees. Once you're in the flare, you need to bring the thrust levers to idle by touchdown, and probably earlier. So as you saw in my landing, I idled the thrust levers before I touched down. If you don't, they will spool up the engines and it will try and maintain your V approach speed even as you are flying along the runway. So from 30 feet, you probably want to idle them, maybe at 20 feet, certainly by touchdown. Again, if you find that you're sinking out of the sky faster than expected, you can leave them on a bit longer, but again, they must be idle by touchdown. If you find that the engines are spooling up as you're trying to land, it could be that you aren't bringing those thrust levers to idle by touchdown. Or maybe you're not bringing them to idle before then. Like I said, I had them at idle by 20 feet on that last one. Then once the main gear touches down, you can select reverse, which I do by pressing F2 by default. I just tap that and it brings it into idle reverse. And finally, once the nose wheel's down, we're looking for all the usual bits, deceleration and reverse of screen. So let's have another go. But this approach, I thought it would be fun to try it at dawn. So we're having a bit of a sunrise. And as you can see, these amazing graphics with the scratched panel in the window and the ripples in the water, really beautiful. There's not much difference doing this in day and night. You need to still be looking out towards the end of the runway. The runway edge will be lit if you're landing at night, so that helps. And then, of course, as you get lower, your landing lights will light up the ground and make it a bit easier. So let's have a go at that technique again. In order to get this approach speed, you have to set it up in the MCDU, which again I cover it in my ILS tutorial, but pretty much this is left as Microsoft Flight Simulator set up the weights and so on. If you go into performance, I entered the weather for the airport, which gives us the QNH temperature, the wind, and then it gives us our calculated V approach at 145, and I've selected flaps full for this landing. So here we go, same again now. Soon we'll be passing through 500 feet. I'm going to look out more. Looking to keep 2 whites, 2 reds on the pappies outside these indicators here. As we get lower, I'm going to be looking to drive the aircraft towards the middle of the touchdown zone. And as we pass through 50 feet, get ready to flare. 30 feet, I'm going to pull back on the nose slightly. And soon after, bring those thrust levers to idle. Then I'm going to hold the nose there and let it settle onto the runway. Once the main gear touches down, selecting reverse. Letting the nose wheel gently settle, again not pushing forward on the side stick, just letting it settle.
60, 50, 40, 30, 20.
Thrust levers to idle, hold the nose, don't do anything, let it settle, touchdown. F2 to get reverses out, let the nose wheel settle, and then rolling out. You can see on final approach the airplane did a bit of a bank there, which is a glitch that does seem to happen every now and then. Very frustrating, but hopefully that will get resolved soon, because of course the real aircraft doesn't do that to you. For this landing, let's have a look at a bit of a crosswind. So to do this, I'm going to set it up in the weather system. The runway is 040, so I'm going to select my wind at the ground layer, and we've currently had this 4 knot tailwind. A headwind have obviously been 240. 0 degrees. But I'm going to put it straight across, and I'm going to increase it to, let's make it about 15 knots. Let's make it 18 knots actually. So there we go, a bit blustery. The gusts, I'm going to lower those gusts. That's not really important for the technique, because that is a ridiculous amount of turbulence, really. Because the gusts are coming from the wrong heading. So make sure, I've had this in Flight Simulator, if you do set up gusts, set them to, they'd be a little bit different. So maybe I've got 132 wind, 153 gusts. So something like that, but it's to within a similar angle. Otherwise, you get that extreme sort of shaking. And even this is a bit too much. Let's try and be a bit closer. Lower the frequency, lower the speed. Or maybe we need to increase the frequency. Okay. So there we go. We have a rough setup. And now we're going to fly around in the crosswind. So for a crosswind, what's different? Well, a lot of it is the same. For a crosswind landing, we will arrive pointing at the runway with a bit of drift on, otherwise known as crab. And I will show you what that is now. So to show you what drift is, we can look on the navigation display. The runway is heading 0, I think it's 039, something similar, close to 040. We can see this if we select the LS on the rows. It shows us the localizer course. So that is the course, or otherwise inbound track of the runway. Your track is where you're tracking over the ground. Your heading is where the aircraft is pointing. Let me turn off the terrain to show it a bit clearer. So my heading is this yellow line up here. My actual track is this diamond here. And as you can see, the track is slightly to the left of my heading because with the wind from the right, we have to point slightly to the right to get the track to line up with the runway. If the wind was from the left, our heading would be slightly left of the expected track. So it would be to the left of this course of 039. So at the moment, the wind is from the right, so we're pointing slightly right. And you'll see that on final approach. Okay, let's put the gear down. Arm the spoilers. Flaps to 3. And flaps to full. So as we look out at the runway, I'll expect to see that the runway is ever so slightly left of where we were. We'll be pointing to the right. Now we are still on the extended center line. If you imagine the center line runs out from the runway, it goes right underneath us, and you want to keep it running right beneath your seat. But as you can see, we're actually pointing to the right slightly, which is to be expected in these conditions. So how are we going to manage this for the landing? Well, keep yourself on the center line and do the same as before. So 30 feet flaring, thrust levers to idle. And the difference here is we're going to use the rudder in the last few feet. So once you're below 30 feet and you're entering the flare, you raise the nose slightly. Before touchdown, just squeeze a bit of rudder on to try and point the runway down the center line. In the real aircraft, you can land with a little bit of drift on. It's a few degrees, but what we try and do is just remove the drift by using the rudder. It doesn't have to be absolutely perfect. It just needs to get the aeroplane pointing down the runway. There's 1,000 feet. We are stable again. So I'll call it out as I do it. I haven't tried this much in Flight Simulator, so we shall see how the aircraft behaves. I'm not entirely sure how the characteristics handle. As we said, there are some differences, and there is this bug where it rolls to the left, which is very frustrating. If you do find you have that bug, it's not how the aircraft normally behaves, that sudden roll. So let's use the same technique as before. I'm going to take out the autopilot now, so that's autopilot off. Got a rate of descent at 800 feet per minute at the moment, so I'm going to try and maintain that. The aircraft is generally stable, the real aircraft especially. It tries to keep the pitch where it is, and it doesn't need too much input or correction. So if you're having to move your joystick a lot, you're probably doing a bit too much work or more than you need to. Okay, so autopilot off, keeping ourselves on that center line. As we said, the aircraft is primarily stable, so it should not take too much input. Driving us towards that touchdown zone, 2 whites, 2 reds outside the window, so that's fine. Keep that rate of descent steady at 800. At 50 feet, thinking about flaring. 30 feet flare, raise the nose, thrust levers to idle, and now just a bit of rudder to get the drift off, point us down the runway. There's the touchdown. You'll need to hold that rudder in to keep you on the center line. If you immediately release it when you touch down, it won't work. And now reverses are out, and we are decelerating. And there we go. It is quite tricky. The characteristics in the simulator are not quite as you might expect. So sometimes it does do some strange things. but it is possible.
100, 60, 50, 40.
That's all for today's video. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it, and hopefully it will be able to give you a bit of extra context on landing the Airbus A320 NEO in Microsoft Flight Simulator. There'll be more tutorials to come in future videos where we'll talk about some of the other features that we can do with this. As I said at the start, this is not for any real world use. It is just a rough guide. There are lots more details out there, and hopefully we'll see some of those as we go through more flights using this aircraft and this flight simulator. So that's all. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope to see you again in another video soon.